Hey, wait a minute. This is grass. We've been eating grass. So, secondary or primary consumers, right? Secondary consumers when we eat them in a burger. Other primary consumers when we eat the bun. So the light enters the system as sunlight. Even there, a lot of it is lost as heat. Only a small fraction of the sunlight actually gets converted into bond energy. And then that passes up through, as what that says, chemical energy into the consumers. And it's always frittering away as heat. So maybe 90% of the energy that's in each level is lost going on to the next level. So you don't have as many predators. And of course, it all depends on the energy uses of the predators. That a rattlesnake can get by on a lot less energy because it isn't cranking heat out itself all the time compared to, say, a cat. Or even a mouse, for that matter. Is it our snake can go the entire winter without eating, where the mice, can only go a couple of days, really. So we're going to talk about energy. Energy, not an easy thing to define. If you took science in like elementary school, middle school, is that they often say energy is the ability to do work, which is, I don't know what the heck that means. Energy is one of those things where you kind of know it when you see it. And it comes in a lot of forms. And it does make stuff happen. But that's not a great definition either. For our purposes, we've got electromagnetic energy coming into the system. We're going to ignore chemosynthesis where it starts as heat. And we have bond energy, which is what the energy will eventually be converted to, generally by moving electrons around. So we're on our way toward photosynthesis as a process. And start by talking about energy, in this case being electromagnetic energy, waves of energy, where the waves are different sizes. We'll come back to that. But they have a certain amount of tuning. They being a wave, they have a certain level of vibration. And they interact with materials in the world in different ways. They may bounce off of it, as red wavelengths bounce off of the red car. They may be absorbed by it, which the other wavelengths are absorbed by the red paint. They may pass through materials like the windows in the car do, although your windshield typically will not let ultraviolet energy through. Now, ultraviolet energy doesn't interact with any of our sensory systems, so we can't see it. Honeybees can see it, but not people. And again, we have molecules that absorb and respond to ranges of red, ranges of green, ranges of blue. It literally shakes our receptor protein molecules and activates the cells that send a command to your brain going, we're seeing this, we're seeing that. Plants typically are using mostly green wavelengths from all the different color wavelengths that we can see. Visible light, here's a big surprise. Visible light is light that we can see. It's a fairly narrow range of energy, but it's a pretty decent fraction of the energy from the sun that actually reaches the surface of the Earth, is that a lot of the energy that comes in from space bounces off or scatters off of the atmosphere. And so there's a relatively narrow range of energy that gets to us. Off of the red side, we have infrared, which is the generally comes off of things that are warm. People can basically conflate infrared energy and heat. And off of the purple end of the visible spectrum, you've got ultraviolet, which, as I said, some animals can see. We can't. Beyond that, there's not a heck of a lot of available energy in the world around us. In the case of plants, chlorophyll, the major energy capturing molecule in plants, does not capture most green frequencies. There's no one green frequency. There's a range that our systems register as green. There's a range that we register as blue. There's a range we register as red. Trying to figure out how to get yellow out of that. A bunch of the colors are absorbed by the chlorophyll. Some of it makes it out the other side, or when you looked up at the bottom of a leaf, it would be completely black. But it's mostly green. But there are other things in the darkness underneath as well. So energy travels as waves. Now a wave has a certain amplitude, which we're not going to get into, but it has a certain distance between every wave peak. Waves are a certain length, so there's a distance between the peaks and the valleys. That distance is the length of the wave. Now, given that these are electromagnetic energy traveling at the speed of light, which varies depending on what the light is going through, but in a vacuum, it's standard, everything travels at the same speed. If the waves are close together, then in a second, a whole bunch of them are going to hit an object. If the waves are very far apart, in a second, nowhere near as many of them are going to hit an object. So there's a connection between the wavelength, the frequency, how many of them hit in a second, and the amount of energy contained. So let me scribble some stuff down. May as well get used to energy as capital E. So the nanometers, thousandths of a nanometer, 10,000th of a nanometer. Now we're getting into 1,000 nanometers, a meter, a kilometer. This narrow range here is what we see as visible light. Here's your ultraviolet, here's your infrared, here's X-rays and gamma rays, which travel through space but they tend to get absorbed or reflected off of the atmosphere, so they don't really make it to the surface. So even if you had X-ray vision, there wouldn't be a lot to see. And microwaves do come off of things in space. That's why there's radio telescopes. But again, not a lot of penetration in the atmosphere. So, I mean, we use them to feed our cell phone networks and broadcast radio and TV and stuff. But typically, what's reaching us from space is fairly weak in the first place and doesn't really get to the surface. Now these waves are getting bigger. I don't know why they're called microwaves. They're bigger waves. They're not really tiny waves, but they're called microwaves. And when they interact with matter, they can be absorbed. They can be reflected. They can be bounced, they can be scattered. That's why the sky is blue, is that a lot of some of the blue frequencies tend to not make it directly down to the surface. They tend to bounce around a bit. If you look at the sun, near the sun, the sky is relatively white. Away from the sun, you start to see the effects of that scattered blue light. It's been bouncing around up there for a while. It finally gets down to your eyes, and it makes the sky blue. There's also a process called reradiation, which is pretty important for what we're about to talk about. Electrons have vibrational frequencies. They're sensitive to the vibrational frequencies of different types of waves, different types of electromagnetic energy. So certain materials, the electrons, especially the outer electrons, which are more accessible, will react not to every single type of electromagnetic energy, but to just the certain frequencies of electromagnetic energy. They'll absorb it. And when they absorb it, it speeds them up. And when it speeds them up, they can't stay at the level they're at, they jump. They jump to the next level out, or they jump completely off. We talked about this earlier. Ionizing radiation will peel electrons off the outside of atoms. But in the case of this particular type of reradiation, the electron goes out, it's now all alone in an outer shell, not a stable environment. The shell underneath it isn't completely full, that's not stable either. So it will tend to absorb, jump, and pretty quickly jump back down. But that process expends energy as heat. The jumping back down, it's got to go slower, it's got to release energy. It releases electromagnetic energy, but now it's a different frequency than what it absorbed in the first place, right? Energy absorbed, jump back, energy released, different frequency than what went in. Reradiation. When we look at space dust and want to know what the components are, certain materials with starlight coming through them will re-radiate certain frequencies that were not in the original starlight. And so we can analyze at a great distance materials in space dust. That's how we figured out there were organic materials out there. We'll talk about that quite a bit later. Re-radiation is a really big deal in photosynthesis. Pigments are called out because they have color. But what does that mean? It means that they bounce off just some frequencies. They tend to absorb some and reflect some. Sometimes they re-radiate at a different color. And we have pigments in our receptor systems. Plants have pigments in their absorption systems. Chlorophyll is the main one. But plants also have a whole array of other colored compounds, other pigments called carotenoids. Here's a big surprise. The original one was orange, was found in carrots. Beta-carotene is a carotenoid. So you got a plant. If you grow it under green lights, it'll be very unhappy because it can't absorb much from the green. There may be a couple of frequencies it can access, but mostly it's going to be unhappy. There's a few other frequencies. If you look in the book, the absorption waves of chlorophyll, you can see the graph. And you can see the absorption waves of carotenoids. Carotenoids are helpers. They are better at utilizing the energy, the frequencies that chlorophyll is not that good at, and it passes that energy into the chlorophyll. But that's not the only thing carotenoids do. There's, as I said, a whole array of different chemicals. Since they can produce colors other than the green of the plant, they are often used to make parts of the plant stand out to potential partners that are gonna move pollen, move seeds. That's pretty much it. And so there's a way to signal to potential pollinators, okay, we're ready to go. Pollen's ready to go, come in and get it. We'll give you something for it. We'll give you some food, we'll give you other bribes that they produce. Well, how does the animal know that the pollen is ready? The flowers, which probably were generated originally with chlorophyll, the chlorophyll is kind of pulled back out. And the carotenoids give the flowers a color that makes it stand out against the green. The carotenoids give a fruit a color that makes it stand out against the green. And then the fruit itself is the bribe for the seed spreader. They come in and they eat the fruit. The seeds are resistant to digestion. They go in one end and out the other with a little bit of fertilizer on it. The fruit itself is not there to feed the seeds. The fruit is there to spread the seeds. And as you know from the first semester, fruits aren't always edible fruits, as anything that is there as a way to spread seeds from the parent plant in an angiosperm is a fruit. But carotenoid's pretty important. Basic reaction of photosynthesis. Carbon dioxide, if you're balancing the equation, there's 6 of them, but biologists don't tend to balance equations unless we absolutely have to. Carbon dioxide and water, using light and a whole mess of enzymes, produces glucose, C6H12O6, with oxygen as a leftover. My, what an ugly tree. Where the heck did my leaf pile go? It went back home. Don't you have anything bigger than a rake? The colors in fall foliage are the carotenoids that have been there all along. They're in the leaves in the summertime. They're just overwhelmed by the amount of chlorophyll in the leaves, with some exceptions like red maples and some other things where you can see some of the coloration of the carotenoids in some of the plants. But when the trees cut the water supply off to the leaves, usually the first molecules to kind of fall apart are chlorophylls, so they no longer reflect green. And the colors that you see are the carotenoids that take a little bit longer to break down until eventually you're seeing the brown of the cellulose. That's the structural component of the leaves. Oops. We're not going to get into the real little details of this. Drive you a little nuts. I remember when I learned, I took my class in plant physiology. I spent days with a huge sheet where I had laid out and drawn all the molecules and had all the names and labels and stuff in order to learn the processes. So that is something that in more advanced classes you would wind up doing. Here we're going to keep it relatively simple. In angiosperms, actually in Plantae in general, you've got an organelle with chlorophyll in it. That's where photosynthesis happens, as opposed to respiration, which happens partly in the mitochondria and partly in the cytoplasm. All stuff that'll come up later. So you need light, you need water. Remember, hydrogen is good at moving electrons around. That's what you're pulling off the water. The water is going to supply hydrogen to move electrons around. And you wind up with oxygen coming out. Remember, electrons feed through membranes and are used in a process to generate ATP. The hydrogens themselves are used to generate NADPH. That makes sense. The hydrogens do. You need to regenerate. The ATP gets used here to make sugar. Produces ADP and phosphate, which got a feedback here and here to be remade. NADP plus feeds back in here to pick up the H's. Carbon dioxide feeds into this cycle, Calvin cycle, and will eventually come out sort of as sugar. Tends to come out as half sugars, and then the sugars are constructed slightly outside of the cycle. Well, this part only works when there's light. It generates this stuff. If you have a backlog of this will keep working until it uses up the ATP and the NADPH. They used to call this the light reaction and the dark reaction. But the thing is, this doesn't wait for it to get dark. It starts to work as soon as this gets generated over here. So now the two reactions are called the light-dependent reaction and the light-independent reaction. On a really nice sunny summer day around here, the sun goes down maybe about 8:30, is that this backlog has built up enough that in a lot of local trees, this is continuing until maybe midnight. It takes a while to work its way through this backlog of material that's been built up. Before we get into the reaction, we'll talk about the basic process of capturing and using the light. It is chlorophyll, but it isn't every molecule for itself. They cluster. They form what are called antennal complexes. I will write this down in a second. So this is embedded in the membranes inside these, thylakoids? Yeah. I'll tell you something. I swear that the guy who taught plant physiology called them thylakoids. And that's been embedded in my head, so now I no longer trust whether I'm remembering the name right, thylakoids or thylakoids. It's like larynx or pharynx. People call it pharynx. They reverse the letters and get pharynx or larynx. Not larynx so much as pharynx. And you know, I could be wrong. Maybe I learned it wrong, but I always have to re-look to make sure that I'm talking about it right. So there's piles of membranes in here, stacks. Embedded in the membranes are these antennal complexes with lots and lots and lots of chlorophyll molecules. Light comes in and the chlorophyll kicks off an electron. There's a little group, here's called the reaction center. Everything funnels into the reaction center. So there's a reaction center sitting and there's electrons just coming in and coming in and coming in. Because you need a decent number of electrons in order to generate the ATPs that you're trying to generate. Also, you need it built in a certain way. So the light dependent reaction in the thylakoid membrane. every once in a while I have to look over my shoulder and make sure I'm actually writing so you can see it on the screen. I left the electrons out of there. So I tuck it in. It doesn't need to be up there. I just need it to be there, but I left it out and realized when I reached the end of the sentence, I'd left it out. So the light comes into the antenna complex. It feeds electrons into the reaction center. The reaction center is just a couple of chlorophylls embedded in a protein matrix. It works a couple of different ways. You'll see this. I'm just going to mention this in passing, that you've got a 680 response and a 700 response. It's a slightly different tuning to different frequencies of light. In a lot of ecosystems, iron is a limiting factor for plant growth. It's especially true in the oceans where iron doesn't tend to dissolve great in the water, so it doesn't tend to get very far from the outflow from the continents. There's whole iron deserts in the middle of the ocean where you don't find a lot of plant growth. There's not a lot of plant plankton. This is why iron is a controlling factor. This molecule, Ferredoxin, there's a reason why iron is Fe. This is from the old Latin word for iron. Ferredoxin feeds the electrons back to where they came from, right? If electrons are always being fed in, they're coming off of chlorophylls, they gotta go back out after they've been used. They go through the membrane, get used to make ATP, and Ferredoxin ferries them, got iron, got a mineral in it, ferries them back to where they need to be. Okay, so we're going to stall this here because this video's gotten long enough. We'll pick up the light independent reaction in the next one.